Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S all the way down to the C tier for patch 12.7. Overall, the defining characteristics of this patch can be summed up in one word: flex. Playing flexibly is the key to doing well, which is aided by a well-balanced meta. There's plenty of champions and synergies to choose from, and we're going to give some insight into which ones are the most consistent. With that said, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT shows and tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come. Be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our tier list, we have the synergies in the S tier, which consists of Clockwork, Mastermind Scholar, Enchanter, and Socialite. These traits will look familiar as they're the same 5 from our last tier list. This is because all of these traits can be splashed into any mid to late game composition, making them a vital part of the meta. If anything, their value has gone up even more in 12.7, with flex play being more prevalent. Kicking off the S tier is Clockwork. There's not a major difference in value between Clockwork and the other S tier splash traits, but it does get played quite often, especially whenever a player utilizes an Innovator flex board. Orianna is such a good utility unit that doubles as supplementary damage, so having her in with a second Clockwork is always going to be worth the 2 board slots. Mastermind Scholar are lumped together as usual because of Silco. Silco is still one of the best late game champions, which is saying a lot considering the meta favors 4 and 5 cost units currently. Just be aware that Silco 1 can grief your board. Besides Silco, Renata has also returned to the forefront of the meta, with Renata Bruiser being one of the more common mid-game comps. Then there's Kassadin for Mutant, Syndra for a plethora of early to mid-game boards, and Zyra as an alright utility champion. Plenty of value to be had with the Scholar tree. Not much needs to be said about Enchanter that we haven't already said. Great champions, useful bonuses, and decent augments. What else could you want from a splash trait? And to end the S tier, we have Socialite. Socialite took a small dip with Aurelia carry falling out of favor, but in general, Socialite is still one of the more played synergies. Gnar provides Striker, Seraphine Innovator, and Senna Enchanter. It's safe to say at least one of those 3 champions will be useful to the majority of players in every single lobby. Galio is also not too shabby after being incrementally buffed over patches, though it can be difficult to fit him in late game. Let's now move on to the A tier, which consists of the synergy Striker, Innovator, Transformer, Mutant, Bruiser, Rival, Assassin, Arcanist, and Bodyguard. These are the bread and butter of the meta. Basically, every game you can play one or multiple of these traits, toss in one of the S tier synergies, and you're good to go. To no one's surprise, Striker is at the top of the A tier because nerfs apparently mean nothing to Sivir. Lobbies are rampant with Striker boards finishing in the top 4 even with just a Sivir 1. That said, it's not massively dominating over every other synergy in the meta, it's just consistent, as are a lot of other options. Even though it is fairly common to see Force, Striker is at least in a balanced state for now. Whenever a flex meta pops up, you can be certain that Innovator will be near the top. That's the case in 12.7, as many compositions can be played with Innovators as the base synergy. Seraphine, Echo, and Jace are great units to build a composition around, and each provide a ton of value in different ways. Even going full 7 Innovator boards is still viable, albeit much harder to pull off. When there are Innovators, you can bet your lunch money that there's going to be Transformer. Jace is a cornerstone for any late game board utilizing Innovator. But the beauty of Jace, besides his handsome face, is that players can flex into a plethora of other boards. This can be to use him as a main damage dealer, extra damage, utility with his backline ability, or as a frontliner. Truly, Jace is one of the most versatile champions in the current meta. The surprising meta development of 12.7 is Mutant. Mutant has always been one of those somewhat fringe compositions because only 1 or 2 of the mutations were worthwhile to play most of the time. Now there's a way to play around most of the mutations, which has a lot to do with Kha'Zix. Obviously, Synaptic Web is still broken when the player has an emblem, but Kha'Zix manages to make several other mutations viable. Cybernetic and Voracious were never bad and had a place in the meta, but Kha'Zix has really elevated their value. Even Blademaster, Voidborn, and to a lesser extent Metamorphosis have all become playable thanks to Kha'Zix. Of course, Malzahar is still doing his duty in the back line, and no one should underrate Kai'Sa, but Kha'Zix definitely brought much needed consistency to mutants. Oh, and a mutant emblem is one of the best emblems in the meta by far, further increasing the synergy's value. Trailing behind Mutant is Bruiser. Bruiser is back to being the go-to frontline for a lot of compositions, with Renata returning to the meta and mutants becoming more common. Vi is also an important champion to take note of, as she adds a lot of value late game. The only downside for Bruiser is that they do scale poorly, since defensive stats eventually trump bonus health. Speaking of Vi, Rival is doing quite well for itself in the meta, with both Vi and Jinx being key champions for several comps. Vi provides frontline, while Jinx can be used either as a main carry or just as an extra secondary damage. The best part is you can still play these two champions together, since Built Different often uses them to cancel out the rival trait. We praised Kha'Zix earlier, so it shouldn't be too surprising that Assassin is back in the meta crowd. This is definitely a glow up from the previous patch, where Assassins were mostly niche, but with Kha'Zix and Mutants being far more common, Assassin is back to being one of the cool kids. Outside of Talon, the options are more limited, though Talon reroll is still floating around the edge of the meta, and occasionally Twitch reroll has value. Not a whole lot has changed for Arcanus this patch, as it's still viable, but not making huge waves in the meta. Ahri and Victor can both be utilized as the main carry, and Vex is still an amazing frontliner. There's just something lacking overall about an Arcanus board. Perhaps that's frontline or CC. Point is, it can be difficult to make work consistently. That said, when an Arcanus board does well, it does really well and is certainly viable in the current meta. At the bottom of the A tier, we have Bodyguard. Bodyguard may not be as commonplace as Bruiser or other frontlines, but it still has a place in the meta, particularly because of Leona, Braum, and Blitzcrank. Main problem is that the Bodyguard trait often doesn't provide enough, so think of the Bodyguard units as companions to other frontliners more so than using them for the trait itself. On to the B tier, which consists of Scrap, Glutton, Chemtech, Mercenary, Debonair, Challenger, Twin Shot, Yordle, Sniper, and Hextech. While these synergies aren't the most consistent, they are useful in various circumstances, or in some cases as the main synergy for a comp. There's a lot of variables, but think of these synergies as less consistent options than those in the A tier. Sitting at the top of the B tier is Scrap. Scrap has had a bit of a resurgence in the meta, mostly thanks to the Striker Scrap board that utilizes 4 of each trait. Jinx also has had a hand in making Scrap more relevant in the late game. Overall, the value of Scrap is still mainly in the early game, but the shields and free item from one component in the late game shouldn't be scoffed at. Looking back on previous tier lists, we decided Tahm Kench, aka Glutton, was a bit too high up. The reason is that while Tahm Kench can be game-changing when players hit him early, the value goes down rapidly the longer the game goes by. Needing to scale with Glutton is crucial, and there's a stark contrast between a 4-3 Tahm Kench and a 6-3 Kench. There's a lot of factors that go into making a Kench a threat, and because of that, we're lowering his value down a bit from where we've had him recently. Chemtech is in an interesting position within the meta because it does have several top-tier champions and a few playable comps. But is that because of Chemtech or the units themselves? For example, Renata Bruiser does use Chemtech, but does Chemtech provide as much value as the other synergies involved? Or whenever Victor is being played, does Chemtech make a huge difference? There's a lot of variables to consider, but the bottom line is that Chemtech does have a place in the meta, but more so as a backdrop for more important synergies. It's useful, but not that useful. As always, Mercenary goes up and down in value every patch for various reasons. How easy it is to cash out is the main factor, and currently, it's not too hard to get a mid-game win with Mercenary for a big jackpot, but it's also not a guarantee. We've seen plenty of times where Mercenary players failed to win a round and took a fast 8th. That lack of consistency puts Mercenary towards the middle of the B tier. Unfortunately, Draven is still struggling to find a foothold in the meta, which overall hurt the value of Debonair. Draven can be a decent carry, but oh boy do players have to Omega high roll to make him function beyond getting a 4th. Zeri has fewer problems popping off, but being a 5-cost carry, you do need to 2-star her, which means most of the time she's just extra damage for a board. Point is, Debonair is extremely volatile. Some of the games it does well, whether that's with Draven, Zeri, or Talon. In other games, it's dog. Volatility and lacking consistency means down to B tier it goes. With no consistent carry to use, Challenger has fallen down to the low end of the B tier. There are times we see it do well, as Warwick reroll isn't completely gone, but on average, Challenger just doesn't have as much of a presence in the meta to be considered good. For most games, it's a bit below average and requires a lot of commitment to do well. Twin Shot has fallen on hard times because it's become so reliant on augments to do well. What's interesting is that the champions are still doing well, just without Twin Shot. Lucian as an AP item holder and sometimes carry is rather common in the meta, and Gangplank can hold his own in the mid game. The breadwinner for Twin Shot is definitely Jinx, as she's one of the strongest late game damage dealers. Overall, Twin Shot still has a place in the meta, but a full-on Twin Shot board is far less common. We heavily considered tossing Yordle down into the C tier, but we can't ignore the value it brings in the early stages of the game with the extra gold it produces. The sad reality is there's really not a place for Yordles outside of the early game, as Corki carry is unreliable. Gnar and Vex are both amazing units in the meta, but not because of Yordle. Basically, we recommend using Yordle to boost your econ, then selling them off in the mid game. We may be harsh on Sniper, but the reality is the 2-trait buff doesn't do enough. For Sniper to be impactful, there either needs to be 4 active or the Sniper's Nest augment. Jin is a great flex carry, and Zeri can do well with Misfortune holding her own in the mid game, but sadly, Sniper as a trait is just not that important. At the very bottom of the B tier is Hextech. Hextech isn't inherently bad right now, particularly in the early game, but it's mostly been replaced by Striker and Scrap. It still has a place in the meta because of Sivir, but overall, it's just not that impactful currently. To end our list, we have the C tier synergies, which are Syndicate, Enforcer, Colossus, and Yordle Lord. For the most part, these traits are just extremely hard to get much use out of in the meta. Syndicate does bring some value to boards using Ahri, but in general, there really isn't much of a reason to play Syndicate. Ashe is still struggling, and Ahri prefers Arcanist, so that doesn't really leave much of a reason to ever play Syndicate other than Happenstance. That said, it still does have several good units like Morgana, Braum, Zyra, and of course, Ahri. Ever since they made Enforcer a 3-piece trait, it's been significantly harder to use. Committing 3 slots is just a bit too much, especially since a lot of the time those champions don't fit within the composition. But there are times Enforcer can still be used, especially when Jace is involved. Just don't expect to see Enforcer used that often. We've said our piece on Colossus many times, this is just too much of a commitment to use. Alistar does have a place in the meta, and Galio to some extent, but playing 2 Colossus is just out of the question in 95% of the games. 4 slots for 2 units? That's just preposterous. And of course, Yordle Lord sits at the bottom of the bottom. Igar is a meme, folks, and 6 Yordles isn't even doing well right now. We can happily ignore this trait even exists. And that's all we have for today's tier list video. The meta is honestly in a good spot, which we can see reflected by the fact that there's no B patch for 12.7. Let us know in the comment section below what synergies you've been having the most success with. Thank you for watching. If you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.